Hello and welcome to a show where literally no one ever stands down. The former media mogul and ex-jailbird Conrad Black, and why he gave Boris Johnson his big break. The almost Tory leader, Andrea Leadsom, on whether the floods debacle is her fault as a recent Environment Secretary. And Anushka Asthana on whether the mess that is this show is all my fault. Jeremy Corbyn's close colleague, John Trickett, on whether he understands what his leader said today about whether Labour supports an independence referendum for Scotland. And our own superstars Parliament. Half of the Vote Leave campaign's Anton Deck, Matthew Elliott, the best-known British Green of all time, Caroline Lucas, and the Labour candidate who is battling to get Boris Johnson out of Parliament, Ali Milani. Watcher, yes, it was bound to happen at some point. The last few days were all about him, after he did what his pal Donald Trump had been urging him to do and extended some kind of olive branch to him, Boris Johnson. Nigel Farage decided at the 11th hour not to run Brexit Party candidates in constituencies won in 2017 by the Tory party, which helps Boris Johnson a bit. But, Boris Johnson probably can't win a majority unless his party wins Labour seats in the Midlands and the North. And that looks an impossible mountain to climb when the Brexit Party is still in the contest there and will split with the Tories the votes of those who want Brexit above everything else. So, to quote the band that Boris Johnson claims is his favourite, the Prime Minister still can't get no satisfaction from Farage and should probably paint it all black. See what I did there, Anushka?
Very clever, Robert. Now, I want to start with a quick question to you. One-word answer, if you can. How do you feel about this election emotionally?
Exhausted.
Exhausted. Well, that makes you a strange fish, because let me show you what other people are saying when it comes to this. This is a YouGov chart. Sorry, wrong chart. Most people, the biggest group, are feeling fearful, then angry and then confused. None of them are saying they're exhausted yet, but I guess they're not doing the same job as you. Now, as for stories that are actually breaking through among people, I'm afraid it's bad news for journalists from Lord Ashcroft. For 42% of people, none of them are. All the big stories so far are registering with under 5% of folk. But look, I don't think that means that people are apathetic. For example, I've spent time this week in the great town of Hartlepool for my Guardian podcast. And up there was frustration about politics, but people really cared about the issues. And a good way to delve a little deeper into those and see what is cutting through is through focus groups. We've got some results here from the polling company JL Partners, including Theresa May's former pollster, James Johnson. They've been talking to people in South East London, and they found that almost everyone has heard of what is going on with Nigel Farage. Oh, Screeny, don't let me down. Keep going. I'm going to show you this as I go. But basically, they said that him stepping aside for Tories in all those seats was good news for the Conservative Party, and that Farage had taken one for the team and united the Leave vote. People had also heard of Jacob Rees-Mogg and his insensitive comments about Grenfell. They called them quite repellent and said that they kind of showed a stereotype of a traditional Tory, although they had to say as well that it wasn't a deal breaker for many of them. Now, as far as getting Brexit done is concerned, Boris Johnson's big motto, well, that was going down very well, including with Remainers who say they just want to get this thing done now. And then finally, public services. There was a pretty cynical response from people when it came to that. They felt that politicians were saying what people wanted to hear, but were unlikely to actually deliver it. Although overall, they thought Labour had an advantage over the Tories when it came to that. Now, if Screeny doesn't let me down, I'm going to give James Johnson I'm going to have to do it without this, Geek of the Week. Robert.
Oh, we love the Geek of the Week. Delighted to be joined by Matthew Elliott, formerly of Vote Leave, working a little bit for the SAJ campaign a while.
Yeah.
Back, Ali Milani, a Labour candidate, and the senior Green, Caroline Lucas. Matthew, if I could start with you. In terms of what Boris Johnson wants above all else, the only reason he called the election, which is he wants a majority.
Yeah.
Has Nigel Farage moved enough by saying he's not going to put contestants in Tory seats?
I think it's definitely helped. Let's not forget there are many sort of Lib Dem seats and Scottish seats where the Conservative MPs will be more likely to get in now.
But that's not a majority, though.
But also I think it's the fact that the Brexit Party will gradually start to deflate in the polls. Essentially what Nigel Farage has done is said that he's happy with Boris Johnson's deal. He's happy with the clarification that Boris Johnson wants a free trade agreement. So what you'll start seeing is the Brexit Party falling in the polls, and that will help those Tories in those Midlands and Northern seats.
So just to be clear, you would not think that unless he stands those candidates down formally from Labour seats, that Boris Johnson's ambition of a majority is dead in the water?
I think that it would be great if he did. He's got until 4 o'clock tomorrow, I think, to stand further candidates down.
No sign of that happening, I'm afraid.
No sign of it happening. Boris can still get the majority, yes.
Caroline, on this whole issue of campaigning tactics, you've, in a way, done a sort of smaller version with the Lib Dems and Plaid Cymru of what, Nigel Farage, possibly out of the goodness of his heart, has done for the Tory party. Realistically, though, pollsters don't think that you can win more than a tiny number of those seats.
We, the Green Party, do you mean?
Well,
or
I mean all of you
generally,
collectively, actually.
Well, I think that it's highly likely that we are going to have a hung parliament again, where just a few seats could make the real difference one way or the other. I really regret the fact that we have such an archaic and undemocratic electoral system that means that we're having to have all of these debates about tactical voting. I would much rather people could just vote with what they want to see rather than having to have all of these trade-offs. And it's been a difficult process. And personally, I wish Labour had been at the table as well, because if Labour had been willing to enter into these negotiations, then we could have certainly scaled up the impact of what's going to happen. But in their absence, I think we did the only thing that we could do in terms of trying to avoid the worst of a Boris Brexit, which looks increasingly now like a no deal. I mean, it's really interesting, this new relationship between him and Farage. I think it basically means...
We'll come back to that, because I've got a very interesting interview with Andrea Leadsom coming up, which I'm sure will take us back to this whole issue of deal or no deal. But Ali, you've been banging on doors under electoral rules. I'm not allowed to say where you've been banging on doors, but you've been banging on doors. What have you been sort of getting back, as it were, when you're talking to voters? What do you think is actually cutting through?
So what I thought would cut through when the election was called, and what I'm seeing is cutting through, is the significance of the election. So every door that we're knocking on, all the conversations we're having, is definitely telling us that people know there's an election happening, and they understand just how significant it is for the future of the country. Brexit comes up, but more than that, we hear a lot about the NHS, and this isn't just.
What comes up most when you're banging on those doors? Is it the NHS? Is it Brexit?
No, the NHS definitely comes up a lot. People are sick and tired of the lack of investment in our hospitals, the lack of doctors, the lack of GPs, the lack of nurses. We hear that both from people who work within the NHS, but people who've also had to use it. There is a general anger within the community, of which I can't mention, that there has been some really, really cruel cuts over a 9-year period, and that is coming to a head. And that's why I think the significance of the election is so important, because it doesn't come out of the context of 2016, but it comes out of the context of so long having a Conservative government that has cut and cut and cut on top of Brexit, on top of universal credit, on all these things. This is the opportunity.
Tons more to talk about. I've got one very quick final question for Matthew. I introduced you as the Ant and Dec of Brexit. You worked famously with controversial figure Dominic Cummings, now Prime Minister's most senior advisor. So, yes or no, asset, or which of these two, asset or liability for Boris Johnson?
Asset.
OK, you're going to have to explain to me later why you see him as an asset, given you have this fractious relationship with him, I think it would be fair to say. Now, a little earlier, I spoke with the Business Secretary, Andrea Leadsom, and I began by asking her how it was she felt about her former Cabinet colleague, David Gauke. I mean, he was in Cabinet with her literally only a few weeks ago, encouraging voters to go for the Lib Dems and not the party he's been a member of for years, the Tories.
Well, you know, I have a lot of time for David. He's been a great colleague for some years, but I do think he's wrong on this. You know, he was, like me, determined to deliver Brexit with a withdrawal agreement, and I'm sorry to see what he's saying today, but I really don't agree with him. We need to get Brexit done. We need to give Boris Johnson a majority so that we can leave with a withdrawal agreement and then move on to the priorities that people have around better education, more police on our streets, more money for our NHS, and actually get Brexit behind us. You know, the uncertainty is disastrous.
But his point is, even if the withdrawal agreement gets approved by a new government, Boris Johnson's statement that we've got to be out fully of the EU by the end of 2020 means he says that there won't be a decent trade deal with the EU and that therefore there will effectively be a no-deal Brexit at the end of 2020.
Well, you know, I absolutely thought this would be the next stage. I mean, you know, a couple of weeks ago we
But
had
it's from your
people
colleague,
saying,
though. It's your erstwhile colleague. This is not somebody who's opposed you all the way through. This was somebody who voted for Theresa May's deal.
And the truth is that the EU and the UK have a political declaration that runs to some 30-odd pages, which is a real template for that free trade deal. They and we have agreed that we will get that deal signed by the end of 2020. And so there is every reason to believe that we will do it. Don't forget, we start from exactly the same rules and regulations. The implementation period that kicks off from the minute we get that withdrawal agreement through Parliament will then take us until the end of 2020, by which time we will have the future relationship buttoned down. And, you know, people said that Boris would never get the withdrawal agreement changed, but he did. And now they're saying, well, you'll never get the free trade deal, and we will. And
But he also said that we would be leaving at the end of October, and we didn't leave at the end of October. So I suppose what I'm interested in is, should we trust him that we're really leaving at the end of 2020 or not?
Those are two very different things. You know as well as I do that the reason we didn't leave at the end of October is because Parliament prevented us from doing so. With the support from the chair, Parliament took control of the order paper on an SO24, which is a procedure in Parliament that is not designed for Parliament to be able to take control of the order paper. They then passed a law which is not something that Parliament should be able to do. None of these things were at the Prime Minister's behest. He's been determined.
I guess all that, but I know that's why he wants a majority.
Exactly.
But I suppose the question I'm putting to you is, if, and it's obviously got to be possible, there isn't a trade deal at the end of 2020 nailed down, in your view, should the UK still leave at the end of 2020?
We have to leave the European Union. You know, 3.5 years now since people voted to leave the European Union. We have to deliver on it.
So just to be clear, David Gorky's right that there is a risk that we won't get a trade deal at the end of 2020.
Is he? The fact is, we
But you're
are
saying there's a risk. I think you're saying there's a risk.
No, I'm not saying there's a risk. I'm saying I'm absolutely confident we will get that free trade deal done by the end of 2020.
Well, confidence is not the same thing as it being 100%, is it?
Because until we reach the end of 2020, we won't know for sure. But what I'm saying is we can count on the fact that the Prime Minister managed to change the deal when people said he wouldn't be able to. We do have a 30-plus page political declaration that sets out that template for that deal. We have a firm commitment from the European Union to signing a deal by the end of 2020. And if we can get a majority, we will also have a UK government and a UK Parliament that's determined not just to leave the EU, but to get that good deal that will work for the UK and for the European Union.
Now, the tenor of everything that you've said, I think, implies that you agree with Aaron Banks, the former colleague of Nigel Farage, that the Conservative Party is now the real Brexit Party.
The Conservative Party is the Democratic Party that's determined to deliver on the referendum.
Are you the Brexit Party?
No,
Has
not
the
at all.
Brexit Party itself become redundant?
No, well, I think it's good that the Brexit Party have recognised that Boris Johnson is the only person who can get Brexit done. But no, I mean, the Conservative Party has a long tradition of being for all people in this country. And what's quite clear for me as business secretary is that businesses are crying out now for the certainty of Brexit with a withdrawal agreement followed on by a proper free trade deal that will mean businesses can have the certainty to make those hiring decisions, to make those investment decisions, and to move on from this appalling period.
OK, but you don't want to be seen purely as the Brexit party, but there is no doubt that in Labour constituencies which the Brexit party is still fighting, the Leave vote will be split. If the Brexit party were not to stand down in those very important seats for you, is there any route for you to get a majority? You must be feeling pretty pessimistic about all this.
Well, I think anybody who wants to leave the European Union with a deal needs to vote Conservative. You know, voting for the Brexit party won't mean we leave the EU. It will simply mean we get Jeremy Corbyn. And more
So would you urge
importantly-
Nigel Farage at this last moment to reconsider and simply not field candidates?
Well, he will do what he wants to do, but I would appeal outside of all political leaders to the public to give Boris Johnson the chance to get Brexit done so that we can move on to their priorities. You know, people are sick and tired of it. Parliament has been absolutely log-jammed for the last 2.5 years. And we've just got to move on. We've got to get rid of the uncertainty and start to talk about the things that really matter, about infrastructure in schools and more police on the streets and more money for our NHS.
In a second, I do want to bring in Anushka on another aspect of the election campaign. But before we get on to that, actually Brexit and the arguments has been squeezed out by a whole variety of other things, including floods. Can I just ask, when you were Environment Secretary, did you ask for more money for flood defences?
Oh, I mean, there's a huge amount of investment going into.
But did you, when you were Environment Secretary, think you were not spending enough?
No, I think we do have big plans. We had then. We've fulfilled a number of new flood defences, and we'll continue to do so.
So why has it failed? Why have so many communities been so damaged?
Well, you know, floods are appalling. When I was Deputy Secretary, I did go to some flood-hit areas and hear firsthand how awful it is when your property floods, and certainly in this last
Did the Chancellor turn you down? Did you ask for more money and did you get turned down?
No, we've never been turned down, and I think the Environment Agency, I think I'm right in saying that they believe that flood defences have protected a further 13,000 properties from floods. I mean, what they've not been able to do is to prevent.
So you didn't do enough, did you, as a government?
Well, I think, you know, there is always more to do, and, you know, that takes me neatly on to the commitment of this government to tackling global climate change, which is, you know, potentially the greater incidence of floods.
Sure, but that is a long-term goal.
Yes,
We've got the short-term problem that floods are happening now. And I do want to bring in Anushka because she's got some very relevant information about the amount of money that's available.
Yeah, you may have noticed, Robert, that there's already been lots of talk about public spending in this election, and we haven't even seen the manifestos yet. The Chancellor, Sajid Javid, has accused the Labour Party of being absolutely reckless with the economy. And it's not a new message. When Jeremy Corbyn released that manifesto in 2017, here was the Tories' advert in response to it. They called it one big bombshell for you and your family, more debts and higher taxes. So they clearly thought it was pretty reckless back then too, which is interesting because the Institute for Fiscal Studies have had a look at the Tories' spending plans too. Let's have a look at them. They start with 2017. So that bottom line were the Tories' plans back then. That line is the Labour manifesto plan. Now, we know that since then, the Conservative Party have put a brake on austerity. This was Philip Hammond earlier in the year when he was Chancellor, raising that line, although still well short of the Labour line. But now this is what the Tories' plans add up to. A sharp rise for that blue line, almost touching the Labour one. In fact, the IFS say that if you look at the latest plans for day-to-day spending, they are close to the levels implied by Labour's 2017 manifesto. Robert.
So that brings me on to an important point. You said in 2017 that Labour's spending plans would be a disaster, and you are now copying them. So why should we believe anything you say about Labour's economic policies and how disastrous they'd be?
Well, let's look at what this Conservative government has achieved. Since 2010, we've sorted out the biggest ever deficit in peacetime left us by a Labour government.
But it's now expanding again at a rate of knots, as you know.
No, it's right. It is absolutely right that as our economy is improving in its performance, we've seen year after year of improvements in the size of our economy. We've got over 3.5 million people
very,
at work
very,
since
very
2010.
slow growth by all historical standards.
Still,
I mean,
still growing faster than European peers. And in the UK, we've had huge amounts of foreign direct investment in recent years. We've been one of the biggest foreign direct investment recipients in the world. The UK's economy is performing well, and really importantly, we've managed to reduce
are you happy
that
with
deficit
1%
left
growth?
by Labour.
Are you happy with 1%
growth?
growth?
No, of course I'm not. But, you know, one of the key reasons why we are trying to get Brexit done is because there is a huge amount of investment just waiting for that certainty that's implied by leaving the EU, by getting it done, and by being able to move on so that businesses can move on. And this economy has enormous potential, and it's right,
but
as
just
the
to be
Chancellor
clear,
has
debt
said.
and deficit under your plans are rising. Are you comfortable with that?
Well, debt will, under the Chancellor's new fiscal rules that he set out,
Will
debt
rise.
as a percentage of GDP
Will rise.
be equivalent to what it is now to falling, and will be lower at the end of the next Parliament.
No, he is saying
No,
he is saying that you are prepared to invest up to 3% of GDP every year. That suggests, because we're not growing at anything like 3% a year, that the debt burden will rise.
He is proposing that we invest in infrastructure, which in turn is designed to grow our economy, so more jobs, more skills, better infrastructure. But his other fiscal rule is to ensure that debt as a percentage of GDP remains at current levels to falling, and will fall by the end of the Parliament. That's really important, because that contrasts with what Labour
simply not consistent with what he said so far. But finally, on that point, the IFS says because of your public spending commitments, there's absolutely no scope for tax cuts. Are you comfortable as a Tory minister going into an election unable to promise tax cuts?
Well, quite clearly, a Conservative government will always prefer to let people keep more of their hard-earned cash.
But you're not going to do it this time.
But if you look at what we've done over the last 9 years since Conservatives have been in government, is we've lifted millions of people out of paying tax altogether. We've seen 3.5 million more people in work. We've introduced the national living wage. We're making people are better off under a Conservative government. We've seen millions of new apprentices.
What is the point of a Tory government if you are not prepared to promise tax cuts? And plainly, you can't.
Well, we will bring forward our manifesto commitments in the near future, and then you will hear exactly what we have to offer. But at the same time, as I've set out, in the last 9 years, we've had 10 years of restoration of our finances, and now we're going to be able to renew our commitment to spending on public services. And we can only do that because we have an incredibly strong economy under the careful guidance and management of a
I point out again, 1% is not tremendous growth by any recent...
Well, it's better than most European nations.
It's better than some European nations. Anyway, as always, it's a joy to see you.
Thank you.
Come back soon.
Thanks.
So, lots to pick up with my distinguished guests. I'm going to start, though, with Matthew Elliott. Andrea Leadsom was absolutely clear that we cannot know until the end of next year whether or not when we leave the so-called transition, we will get a trade deal at the end of 2020, and therefore there is a risk that at the end of 2020 there is a no-deal Brexit. That's a very, very uncomfortable position for voters to be in, isn't it? If they, there are Brexiters who do not want a no-deal Brexit, and you cannot honestly say to them that that risk will be eliminated if they vote for Boris Johnson. It's exactly what David Gawker's been complaining about.
I'm very confident there will be a deal for this reason. Usually when two countries or two trade blocs do a trade deal, there are lots of arguments over aligning regulations between those two countries. In this trade deal, which is unique, we're in a situation where the UK's regulations are the same as the EU's, so it's a far simpler free trade agreement to do than most of them are, so I'm confident that they can meet the deadline.
OK, I think you're a fairly unusual voice in respect of, these are nonetheless complex negotiations. I'm going to come back to all of you on this issue before long, but now I'm delighted to be joined by senior Labour frontbencher, the Shadow Minister for the Cabinet Office, John Trickett. John, very good to see you again. I just want to start. I just want to start with actually what your leader, Jeremy Corbyn, said today about a second referendum in Scotland. Did he or didn't he rule out a second referendum in the lifetime of the next Parliament if he becomes Prime Minister?
Well, look, first of all, let's see how long the Parliament lasts. But our view is that we will fight for every seat in Scotland, we will fight for every vote in Scotland, and then we will have a big job beginning to change the economy, and that will affect Scotland as well. So there'll be some tasks which we need to set to achieve early doors, and then we'll move forward. But John, let me see if there is a referendum or not in Scotland.
Hang on. So the first thing you just said is let's see how long the Parliament lasts. That doesn't sound as though you're terribly confident of getting a majority, does it?
Well, I would expect we will get a majority because we'll persuade the Scots to vote Labour because they're as bored with austerity as anybody else is. And they're bored with the NHS being cut back, and the SNP are a party of austerity now, and we will tackle every single seat. So let's see where we get to after the election. I don't think what-if questions always get...
But I said you're supposed to be, a straight talker. You haven't. You've just dodged...
I am a straight talker.
Well, in which case, tell me, what is your position? If Jeremy Corbyn becomes Prime Minister, will he allow a referendum in Scotland? Yes or no?
There isn't a yes or no answer to some of these questions, and I am a straight talker. I come from Yorkshire, you'd expect that. But look, here's the scenario. We will fight every seat. We are not doing deals with the Scots Nats. We intend to win, and we intend to win votes all over Scotland. Let's see what the composition of the next Parliament is. And then what I think Jeremy said is we'll see how the elections go for the Scottish Assembly, the Scottish Parliament, in due course. We'll see where we get to. But look, there are some major tasks of reconstructing our economy first.
All right, everybody that I think just listen to that will say you are keeping open the option of an indie ref an indie ref to a second referendum in Scotland. I don't think there's any other interpretation we can make of what you just said.
Well, you can interpret it how you like. I mean, look, my words are very clear. Look, we're fighting for every seat.
Right.
We want to win a majority in the country. And we think the Scots want a different orientation for our country.
Okay.
A new NHS, better education and new jobs.
All right.
And let's see where we get to.
OK, another thing I was slightly confused about today, I'm going to ask you. Was America right or wrong to assassinate the IS leader al-Baghdadi?
Well, I don't think anybody would regret the death of a leading terrorist, not at all.
So straightforwardly right.
How you express it.
So they were straightforwardly right to assassinate him. They were straightforwardly right to assassinate him.
I think it is right to take out terrorists by any means possible. Of course, it's better to bring them to justice and try them and let everybody see the crimes and let's see the whole world see what they've done. But if that isn't a possibility, then clearly other actions can be taken. The world has been in a very difficult position posed by terrorists, and I think it's not wrong to take those kinds of actions. I didn't really like the way that the president sort of relished this, if you like, assassination. I thought he was far too bloodthirsty and gory, but yes, I think it's the right thing to do.
Did your leader put the right emphasis on it today when he started by saying that he would have much preferred al-Baghdadi to have been captured?
I didn't hear Jeremy do this. I can't answer, but I've just given you, I think, the same answer. Look, I think criminals should be brought to trial. They should be tried. The crime should be seen by the whole world. These are some of the most villainous people we've seen in the last century, and they have to be dealt with. But if the circumstances arise, no doubt an assassination conducted properly is one of the alternatives which is available.
Now, there's a bit of confusion around the place, as you know, about what Labour's position is on freedom of movement. Your conference voted for more or less maximum freedom of movement into the country. Len McCluskey has said today that's a terrible position for the Labour Party. You have got to put restrictions on. What is the position of the Labour Party?
Well, I think, first of all, I think you need to look carefully at the wording of the resolution at conference about freedom of movement. I don't think it's quite as dramatic as you've just presented it, but clearly there was a resolution there. We need to take account of it. Look, what we want is to... well, first of all, we're going to put, as you know, an option of remain, and if we remain in a ballot, then clearly the freedom of movement will stay as it is now. On the other hand, we'll try to do a Labour Brexit and offer that to the people as well. Under a Labour Brexit, we would want to achieve fair and managed...
Well, I was going to say, would there be freedom of movement under a so-called Labour Brexit?
Well, I think I was going to come to that then when you interrupted me.
Sorry.
We want fair and managed migration, if that can be arranged, and it's part of our negotiating strategy. By the way, we believe we can get a Labour Brexit, which would work, and that will be part of it. But look, the idea that you should scapegoat people because of their country of origin, the colour of their skin, is a disgrace. The idea that you can set numerical targets which you then fail to deliver is a disgrace. And we think a new chance. Human rights, recognising the common humanity of every person on our planet. And they're all Labour principles. They should be principles of Great Britain too. I'm sure that they are. That's what people think. Now, and we'll deal with it in a proper way.
John, we haven't got an enormous amount of time. You've been working on Labour's manifesto, I mean, for years, really. It's something that...
on and off,
is part of your day job. You are proposing very, very significant levels of investment, at least £55 billion a year more than is currently being invested. That will add to the national debt, which is currently 75% of GDP. In your view, is there any level of debt as a proportion of our national income or our GDP that is too high?
Well, I think, look, in general terms, we don't want to be borrowing for day-to-day expenditure. I think that's common sense amongst us all. And I think that we should aim to try to achieve that over a parliament. On the other hand, if you're borrowing to acquire assets which then produce dividends or an income, that's a different matter. So we want to recalibrate how we calculate these things, and we will do that. So I think it's impossible just to give you a yes or no answer to that question.
Well, but I understand that, John. But equally, although, you know, there are many economists who would say that governments have been too frightened of borrowing to invest, nonetheless, you will also be aware that, you know, it's incredibly bad for a business to just borrow and borrow, even to invest, or even for a household to take on way too much debt to buy a house, for example. There must be a ceiling, which you regard as the sort of maximum, for the amount that a government should borrow.
Well, let me just say, first of all, look, I bought a house. It was in ruins. It was a beautiful house in a beautiful location. I bought the house for a price. I then had to reinvest to make the house in a better place. This country is in a similar condition after 10 years of Tory misrule. There will have to be serious investment. And I'm sure that most people listening and watching this programme agree with that. That has to be done. But it's sensible to invest, but it's not sensible to borrow money to pay people's wages, because eventually you are going to end up bankrupt.
But that's not really the point I'm asking, as you know. There is, but nonetheless, you know, there have been economies all over the world who've done exactly what you've said Labour wants to do, which is to borrow to invest, and ultimately they've borrowed far too much and they've gone bust.
Well, look, we will not be imprudent. We will publish our figures after the manifesto's been produced. You're a very distinguished economist, Robert. You will look at those figures carefully. I can assure everybody watching, we will operate in a way which is open, transparent and also prudent. We are not going to wreck this economy. But let me just make one other point.
Fine.
When a government borrows to invest, and it does invest, it creates jobs, which creates income for the government. It creates tax revenues, as you know. And it helps to create a virtuous cycle where the economy begins to grow again. That is the core Labour philosophy, and I think the people of the country, after 10 years of austerity, will understand exactly the point I'm making.
John, lovely to speak to you as always. Now, please don't go away, because in just a minute or two, I'll be speaking to Boris Johnson's old boss, the former owner of the Telegraph newspaper group, Lord Black.
Welcome to The Break, #Peston. Andrea Leadsom has joined us. Hello, and we are going to the jungle.
Oh, yes. Nice.
Check it out, you look great.
Nice hair.
I'm a candidate. Get me out of here, because it's just about to start. Would you do it?
I wouldn't love to do this, but
who would you most like to be stuck in the jungle with?
So it's going to have to be someone who would be really useful. So someone who's strong, who's brave.
Strong, brave.
Maybe Bear Grylls. Yeah, be useful in the jungle.
Oh, you'd like to be stuck in the jungle with Bear Grylls?
Yeah, or maybe...
He'd definitely be good at the task, wouldn't he?
Yeah, exactly. Or maybe Maro Itoje. Did you know who that is? Plays for England. Plays
Rugby player.
Oh, he's the brilliant rugby player.
Really
All right,
good,
big,
really good.
strong, brave.
Yeah.
Who would you least want to be stuck in the jungle
my goodness,
with?
it's going to be, guess, John Burko.
Oh! I thought you were going to say Jeremy Corbyn.
Nothing.
Every time you're at this screen, you have a little pop at
It's
John
because I look
Burko.
at you, Anushka, and it just reminds me.
It reminds you of John Burko.
I don't know
Is
why
it my
that
height?
is.
Oh,
I thought you were going to say Jeremy Corbyn.
Well, that would be too obvious. I don't like to do obvious. I like to kind
you
of
never do
entertain
obvious.
rather-
You never do
Well, what
obvious.
do you think he would do in the jungle that would upset you? John
John
Burko.
Burko, he probably talks. Anyway.
Who is the king or queen of the jungle?
I mean, I'm just going to have to say Toff, because she was queen of
Oh.
the jungle, and she just
I
kind of
thought you meant
springs to
Boris
mind.
Johnson.
No. As in
Sorry.
Georgia Toffolo, yeah.
Oh, OK.
And she's great. I met her once, and we were at a mental health event. I just really warmed to her, so she's going to stay queen for me.
Oh, there you go. That's a good one. Who should do a bush tucker trial? Who would you send up?
Now we're on. Now
In
we're
15
on.
seconds.
Jeremy Corbyn.
You'd
Okay.
send him for the
I would,
cockroaches?
yeah, basically. I'd see how he'd cope.
It's a bit mean.
Yeah. He'd want to borrow lots of
Guess
money.
it is an election.
Yeah, exactly.
Andrea, thank you very much.
Thanks.
Hey! Welcome back. In just a moment, I'll be chatting with the former publisher of The Telegraph, PM's old boss, Conrad Black. But first, here's Anushka.
Thank you, Robert. Well, Boris Johnson once promised your next guest that if he made him editor of The Spectator, he would drop any political ambitions. Black was later quoted saying this. He promised in a hilarious sequence of oaths and affirmations that he wouldn't dream of standing as a candidate. But it wasn't 2 weeks before we found out that he had thrown his hat in the ring as a candidate. I was fairly annoyed when he became an MP. Boris lied to me, but that's Boris. These things happen. Robert.
Thanks, Anushka. Well, I'm delighted to be joined by Lord Black, as we said, the former employer of Boris Johnson. Are you there, Lord Black?
Hello?
Hello, very good to see you. So we've just reminded our viewers that when you made Boris Johnson editor of The Spectator, he told you he had absolutely no desire to be a Tory MP, and then within a matter of a couple of weeks, you discovered that he had applied and indeed swiftly became one.
He applied in 2 different constituencies.
But you're famously a supporter of Boris Johnson as Prime Minister. Does lying not matter in a Prime Minister?
It does, but it is excusable sometimes. And he wasn't the Prime Minister then, and he was a good editor. He cited Ian MacLeod as his example. He was very penitent and admitted that he had changed his mind. He denied that he was lying at the time that he said he wouldn't run, but then he changed his mind and he confessed to that. And I said, well, look, this is nonsense. We'll give it a go, but Boris, if it doesn't work, you're not going to be able to, you'll have to choose between them. And William Hague was the party leader at the time, and I used to encounter him sometimes, and he would say, you know, I don't think either of us is getting our money's worth out of Boris. I said, well, I can't speak for you, but I think he's doing quite well at The Spectator. So, look, it was not his finest hour, but I don't say it, obviously I don't think it disqualifies him from carrying on. He has gone on from The Spectator to be, as everybody knows, Mayor, Foreign Secretary, and Prime Minister. So,
but there are lots of people...
As I said, these things do happen. No one has an absolutely blameless past, and Boris doesn't pretend to be a person who has never put a foot wrong.
No, of course not. But it is the case that many people think he has, should we say, an uncomfortable relationship with the truth. What would you say to those people?
I think that he is perhaps a little reckless with the truth compared to the average successful person. But I think he has, like all of us, learned from mistakes and grown stronger by his experiences. And you know, I don't like to get into judging people's personal lives, but clearly he was somewhat irresponsible in some areas there. It's none of my business. But I think Boris, like all of us, gets smarter as he gets more experience, and I think he's done. I thought he was a very good mayor. I thought he was not so impressive as Foreign Secretary, but I think he's done well in a terribly difficult situation as Prime Minister.
I mean, you're a student of history. Who would you compare him with in terms of, shall we say, you know, both the positives and the negatives in his character?
Did you mean a previous British statesman?
Could be, for example.
Well, as a wit, he is undoubtedly extremely witty, so you would put him with Mr. Disraeli and Mr. Churchill, and at his very best, Mr. Macmillan. He'd be not as distinguished as those, but he does have that instinct of the quick, amusing comment.
But in respect of the kind of flaws we've talked about?
Well, that... yes, that I would have to think about that. I'm not sure that there is. I mean, maybe Fox or someone like that. I mean, the transgressions were different. I don't think Boris is a compulsive gambler as Charles James Fox was. But let us not deceive ourselves, Robert. British history is replete with distinguished statesmen who have had their soft points. You know, weak points.
Totally right. Do you have much contact with him at the moment?
Not a lot. I was 6 weeks in London in the summer, and I was in contact with him then a number of times. That was, of course, a very critical period indeed, the period when he was elected party leader.
Did you manage to give him any advice?
I only give advice to people in high public positions when I ask for it, and he did not ask for my advice, so I didn't give him any.
Now, if he wins, will you come back and sort of suspend your leave of absence from the House of Lords? It's been a while since you've sat in the House of Lords.
Yeah. No, I expect that I will end that absence eventually anyway, whether he wins or not. And and I look forward to doing that.
Next year?
I haven't been able to do it until I'm able to spend more time there, but I believe that time is almost upon us.
So so literally next year, you think you'll be back in the House of Lords?
I believe so. I hope so. Yes.
Now, as somebody who used to own the Telegraph, in fact, you know, had one of the most powerful newspaper empires across the world, one of the things you will have seen is how front pages have changed, particularly in the UK. When you owned the Telegraph, there was a very strict demarcation between news and comment, whereas you will have seen, I think, over the last 2 or 3 years, that many British newspapers have broadly used their front pages simply to argue a case. Some would say it's party political or pro or anti-Brexit propaganda. How comfortable do you feel about those changes to your erstwhile industry?
Yeah, I think it's very sad. I think there's been a terrible deterioration in the quality of the media generally. And I think it's very regrettable, and the consequences of it are extremely serious. Now, I'm more accustomed to discussing it in a North American context because I've been living more here for some years. But we get into this chicken and egg question of how do you get a more enlightened population? And I think the way to get a better media back is to get a more enlightened population, and we have to look for that to an improvement in education and academic standards. I think the deterioration in the state school systems in all of our advanced Western countries has been terribly serious. People are simply not educated adequately now compared to what happened even when I'm getting old, I admit it, but when I was in school. At least we learned something. The methods, as George Orwell pointed out, were sometimes a bit authoritarian, but many of these schools now in the state system, in unionized schools, are basically daycare centers, and it won't do.
So much talked about, but unfortunately we're almost out of time.
These are complicated issues.
It's a very complicated issue, I agree. But one final question, which is just there were reports that President Trump's former advisor, Steve Bannon, was thinking of buying the Telegraph. Do you think that's true? And secondly, would you be for or against that?
It's not for me to say whether I'd be for or against it. I have my doubts that he would mount a serious offer. If the Barclays do offer that group for sale, I think it will fetch some serious bidders. I would be doubtful that Steve Bannon would be one of them.
OK. Listen, it's a real pleasure to talk to you, and we'll hope to see you back in this country before long. Thanks very much.
Thanks so much, Robert.
Now, don't go away, because after the break, we've got so much to talk about with our extraordinarily distinguished panel of senior politicians.
Hello, welcome to The Break, #Peston. I'm joined by all our guests to do what we are doing every week during the election, and that is making a prediction. So here's our chart. Can you see above here is a Tory majority? This is no overall majority, but largest party. Here's a Labour majority. You can see our guests. Andrea Leadsom has said there's going to be a Tory majority of 20. Conrad Black, is this right, has said that there's going to be 24. Would you like to come and tell me what you think is going to happen in this election?
Yeah, so I'm going to take the unexpected approach and say we're going to have a Labour majority come December 13th. I think we're probably looking at somewhere around the region of 15, 20.
115. OK.
Yeah, that's where I would go.
OK.
Hopefully
Caroline?
I'm going for no overall control.
OK, and up or down? Labour the biggest party? Tories the biggest party?
Tories biggest party.
And do you know how by much? How short are they?
3.
Short by 3. Ooh, close. Matthew?
You know what, I think of the next month, people start focusing on the fact that there's really either going to be a hung parliament or a Tory majority. And I don't think they want to sort of see the instability of this hung parliament anymore.
So
I would say, I think Boris will beat what Cameron got in 2015, which was 12.
OK.
I'm going to go for 15.
Plus 15. Thank you all very, very much. You are on our chart. We will be checking this come December the 12th or 13th. Bye.
So welcome back. Anushka, you've got something to tell us?
Yes, I have. When Nigel Farage stepped aside in all those Tory-held seats, I want to show you a tweet that Lewis Goodall from Sky put out. He said what Farage has done is, to be honest, that he doesn't get Brexit without the Tories. The problem for the Remain alliance is they haven't accepted they won't stop Brexit without Labour. Now, that issue of whether or not Remainers can work together is causing great angst. We know that there's a pact between the Lib Dems, Caroline's Green Party and Plaid Cymru in some areas, but elsewhere, Labour and also the Lib Dems are resisting pressure. Now, I have one warning about all of this from the academic Paula Surridge. She says that parties should not expect voters to just move over en masse from one to the other, because just because there's overlap on Brexit isn't necessarily enough. In fact, this chart shows people who voted Lib Dem in the European elections and how they feel about other parties, Labour, Greens and Plaid. The top is if they like them, the middle is if they're warm. But look at this, the people who dislike the other parties, particularly Lib Dems who dislike Labour. I can show you the same for the Greens. There's a little bit less dislike here, but still quite chunky for Labour and the Lib Dems. Robert.
Thanks so much, Anushka. Ali, if I could start with you as a relatively recent Labour candidate, do you regret that there isn't more cooperation between the parties who oppose Brexit? And in particular, do you regret that your own party is not cooperating with the Greens, the Lib Dems, you know, and Plaid and the SNP and so on?
No, I mean, look, I think the problem here is the Liberal Democrats' position, first of all, to revoke Article 50 and almost say to over 17 million people that we don't care what you think. I'm also a student. I was a student under the coalition government, so I don't need dodgy Lib Dem leaflets or graphs to tell me that they lie when they're in government. I would have been comfortable or more comfortable with Caroline and the Greens, but the problem with the Liberal Democrats is, first, I just don't believe that they can be trusted. If Jo Swinson wakes up on December 13th with 30-odd MPs, but the Tories get in anyway, I personally believe that she would be happy with that, and this is all about the Liberal Democrats getting more...
So are you basically saying if you're Jeremy Corbyn and the only way to govern is a pact with the Lib Dems, you tell your leader not to do a pact with the Liberal Democrats?
Yeah, I think if we're in the situation where the Labour Party can go into government as a minority government, that I would certainly prefer that to going in with the Liberal Democrats. But the reality is, I think people know that if you're a Remainer and you want us to remain in the European Union, you have to vote Labour. If you vote Liberal Democrat or if you vote Green, you are just going to get a Boris Johnson Brexit. And I think people know that. When I'm talking to people, people are certainly aware of the historic stake at this election. And the problem is there is much more at stake at this election. I mean, obviously Brexit is a principal issue, but we have to talk about our NHS, our schools, and the Liberal Democrats were part of the coalition that brought all the cuts.
Ali sort of pointed me, Caroline, to, I think, quite an interesting issue for Greens, which is you've been able to do a deal with the Lib Dems because of, you know, a meeting of minds on...
Because they were willing to do so in a way that Labour is not.
But many Greens on really big issues, whether it's the economy or the environment, are much closer to Labour than you are to the Lib Dems.
And we would much prefer to have a deal with Labour. But as you've heard from Ali, Labour will not do that deal. And it feels to us that when there is one area that we do agree about, and actually I agree with Ali about the instant revocation policy, I think that is an incredibly arrogant policy, but my own reading is that the chances of Jo Swinson waking up as Prime Minister are probably fairly slim, so we're fairly safe on that. But what we do agree about with the Lib Dems is that Brexit is so important, it ought to go back to the people to decide. And that is the reason that on that one issue, we will work together with them.
Now, we haven't got a lot of time. I want to bring Matt in. You very successfully ran the Vote Leave campaign, and that was a campaign where allegiances over Brexit trumped party tribal loyalties. Do you see any prospect of those tribal loyalties really breaking down in this election?
I think they will. I think a lot of people will be focused on the fact that there are two choices here. We're either going to have basically a hung parliament and more of the sort of instability we've had the past 3 years, or a government with a majority to actually deliver Brexit. That's a clear choice.
Or it might be a majority for Labour.
I just can't see it happening in the polls.
They couldn't see it in 2017 either.
Yeah, but it is true. I mean, in 2017, the polls were showing one thing all the way pretty much through to a result that was a shock to the Tories.
As things currently stand, it's not going to happen.
Well, we will see. Sadly, that's all we've got time for now. If you need a daily injection of Anushka and me, and of course you do, don't forget to download our podcast, Anushka's Today in Focus and My Calling Peston. See you next Wednesday. Bye.